Hello, today I'm going to show you how to paint the Super Mutant Core set for Fallout Wasteland Warfare by Modiphius, including the recipe I used for green skin tones. Although I originally came up with this scheme for painting Super Mutants, it would easily work just as well for something like Warhammer 40k orks, or anything else that you want to paint with a more neutral, organic green skin tone. Overall, my goal was to paint these to a high standard while still being as accurate to the source material as I could, as I personally get a lot of joy from trying to accurately capture what we see in game. This is of course just one way to approach painting your miniatures. The sculpts are based on Fallout 4, but you may wish to paint them matching one of the other games, such as New Vegas, or come up with your own scheme entirely. I'll also be showing you how to do a simple oil wash. When I first started out I found these quite intimidating, so hopefully I can show you that they're actually quite easy to do, and encourage you to give them a go yourself. Right, enough rambling, let's get on with the video. We're starting out with our minis assembled and primed in grey. From here, the first part of the mini we're going to paint is the eyes. A lot of painters will leave the eyes until last, but personally I find eyes to be one of the trickier parts of a mini to paint. By painting them first, I can make all the changes and corrections I need to without worrying about ruining any of the details around them later on. The green skin tones are next. This base layer is just Citadel's Elysian green with a little black mixed into it. I applied this in 2 thin coats to build up the opacity. The Super Mutants wear cloth in a number of different hues, presumably scavenged from different sources. Checking the Fallout wiki, I looked up exactly what pieces of armour each Super Mutant was wearing, and painted the cloth elements in browns, dark greys and light greys accordingly. To be clear, you absolutely don't have to go for this level of accuracy if you don't want to. If you want to paint them all in a single colour or in your own scheme, they'll still look great. I just personally happen to get a lot of satisfaction out of trying to match what we see in game as closely as I can. To give a bit more variety, I mixed up using Citadel's Thondia brown, Dryad bark and Rhinox hide, hopefully further emphasising the scrounged up nature. To paint the mouths, a pinkish red was used for the gums and interiors. For the teeth on the Super Mutants themselves, as well as for any ropes or skulls around the body, I used Morghast bone. For the mutant hounds, I went for the more yellowed Hobgrot hide. I also used this as the base layer for the hound's claws. Our first metallic paints will be Vallejo's natural steel, applied to certain armour and weapon pieces. The Fallout wiki is our friend here again, as some armour pieces are heavily rusted and need little or no metallic paint, while others are much shinier. In particular, note the helmet and chest harness for the Super Mutant Master, and the light body armour worn by one of the regular Super Mutants. The heavy gauntlets on the brutes are also relatively shiny still. All of the armour is recognisable as a particular piece from Fallout 4, and it must have taken a lot of time to sculpt them from scratch, as there's no way the in-game files have this level of granular detail to them. Some of the other armour pieces still have their original paint colours showing through the rust, so I painted those using appropriate greens and blues. The rust will be painted afterwards over the top. For the rust, I used Citadel's Rhinox hide as the initial base layer, as it's a very rich, warm brown colour. Mostly this was applied as a normal layer of paint, but where I wanted colour showing through, I either dry brushed it or used a wet brush to feather the edges somewhat. To give the impression of dirt on the still shiny metallic areas, Steel Legion Drab was thinned heavily with water and then kind of stippled on. For more deteriorated metal surfaces, and those that had been base coated in brown, I thinned Scrag Brown heavily with water and dabbed it over the surface. This was mostly targeted into recesses where moisture might have pooled, but it was also applied generally over the surface to provide some variation. At some points I used a clean damp brush to remove some of the excess paint or move it around before it dried. Two of our mutants are carrying pipe weapons, which were painted in 2 colours, Mournfang brown for the metal areas and Baneblade brown for the wooden components. Baneblade brown was also used for the bores and wooden hafts of sledgehammers carried by our characters. Finally, the shortened hunting rifle wielded by the Super Mutant Master has its stock painted in a warm brown, while the rest of it is touched up with Vallejo's natural steel. The wrap is painted with Corax white. As a side note, I like that the Super Mutants are so large they can wield a rifle as a pistol. It's a neat detail. To paint the Molotov cocktail held by one figure, the bottle was painted with Citadel's Grey Sear, while the label was painted with Corax white. This is to match the design of the Surkov vodka bottles in game, which are what the textures for the Molotov seem to be based on. The last detail to base coat is this mutant's aviator cap. I used Wildwood contrast paint to get the initial dark leather colour, then picked out the lenses with a grey blue and the metallic details with natural steel. Now we have all of the colours on the Super Mutants themselves painted, we're going to move on to the bases. You can make these quite bright and colourful if you want, but personally I kept them relatively muted so as not to draw the eye away from the mutants themselves. That said, I still wanted to pick out all of the detail on these bases, which I did like so. First, the earthen sections of the bases were layered with Steel Legion drab. This was applied twice to build up the opacity. Tarmac was painted with Citadel's Skaven Blight Dinge, a relatively warm grey, while the more neutral Dawnstone was used for concrete pavement. Stone slabs were picked out with Karak stone to give a bit of variety from the greys. Lastly, rusted metal components were painted with Rhinox hide and Scrag brown, in the same manner as the darker armour pieces. Now, instead of going onto the washes, we're actually going to paint the first highlight on our skin sections. This way the wash will stain more of the skin with colour, and will help smooth the transitions between the two layers. Pure Elysian Green was applied as a volumetric highlight to the areas of skin. What this means is that instead of picking out the hard edges to maximise contrast, we're instead aiming for a smoother gradient that more closely imitates how light falls on rounded, organic shapes. Natural and ambient light from the sun also tends to be softer than something like a nearby lamp would be, as some of it has been scattered and bounced up from the floor and objects around the figure. Once the glazes have dried, I washed all of the skin sections with Reichland Flesh Shade. This gives our Super Mutants that reddish sickly hue, especially in the recesses. The bases and cloth or rope details were given a wash of Agrax Earthshade, while the wooden components were washed with Nuln Oil. We're going to leave the armour alone at this stage though. The washes have given an unappealing shininess to our minis, but don't worry, we're going to be fixing that with a matte varnish. First though, we want to apply our final volumetric highlight to the skin. This is done with thin glazes of Elysian Green mixed with a small amount of Corax White. Again, apply this to raised areas of the musculature, but try to avoid too many sharp transitions where possible. That said, it's still worth picking out details like tendons. For leather straps, we're going to apply some wear and scratches. I first use a mix of Thondia Brown and Talon Sand, then followed it with pure Talon Sand. Finally, I dry brushed Steel Legion Drab over the lower halves of the minis. This was focused on the feet and calves, but also applied to the clothes and other details where dirt might have gotten. Now I'm going to show you how to do a simple oil wash. Oil paints are a little different from acrylics, so I put off using them for years, but they're actually really easy to work with if you get yourself set up properly beforehand. They also let you do some things that would be much harder to achieve with acrylic paints, as the slow drying time means you can go back with some thinners and easily wipe out any mistakes or clean up any blends that you're not quite happy with. For this oil wash, we're going to need some oil paints, in this case black and burnt umber, some oil paint thinner, a couple of brushes, a paper towel, and something to mix our wash in. Start by squeezing a small amount of each colour into the container. You really don't need very much for this, as oil paints have a high pigment load, and something like this quantity will be more than enough for all of the models we have here. Next, pour in some thinner, and mix the paints together with a brush. Then, using the same brush, simply brush it over the model as you would with any other wash. Notice how it flows slightly differently, travelling further along the recesses than an acrylic wash would. If your wash is too heavy, don't panic. Simply go back with a different brush, dipped in thinner, and wipe the wash off the mini. Then add a little more thinner to your wash, stir it around, and try again. Once it's had a few minutes to settle, we're going to use a brush with a little thinner to remove some of the oil wash from raised areas where we don't want it. We can also use a dry brush with no thinner to soak up some of the excess wash in areas where it's pulled too heavily. If you like, you can also try using a dry paper towel to wipe over the top of the model, picking up excess wash in the process. Take your time with this and enjoy the process. You have several hours of working time with oil paints, so you can really play around with them and try different things until you're happy with how they look. I applied the oil wash over the whole miniature, including the bases, where it did a great job of showing the lovely textures in the concrete and armour. I removed a lot of the excess where it pooled on the musculature, as I didn't want it to cover up the red wash we applied earlier, just shade it a little. The last step of painting these models was varnishing. Once they'd been left for 24 hours to make sure the washes had fully dried, I mixed some ultra matte varnish from Green Stuff World with a tiny bit of Lamian medium to thin it, then brushed it over all of the non-metal parts of the models. This will give the models a lovely matte finish that will show off all of the careful blending we've done. Just be careful not to let the varnish pull too much in any recesses. Leaving the varnish off the metal components will mean they reflect the light a little differently, adding interest to the minis and helping show that different materials are present. For the same reason, a gloss varnish was applied to areas that we'd expect to be reflective, such as the glass on the aviator goggles and Molotov cocktail, and the insides of the mutant hounds' mouths. That's our models finished. I really enjoyed painting these minis. The Fallout range is so detailed that it makes them a real delight to paint, and now I've finally got a good core of Super Mutants to use in game as well. I hope you've enjoyed this video though. Let me know if there's anything you've learned from it, or if you think there's anything I could improve for next time. Until then though, I've been Mark, have a wonderful day.